Hello, everybody, and welcome to Neuroscience for Numpties. I'm your host, Joe, and I hope you are all having a wonderful day. If you have me on in the background, welcome. I hope you hear something you like. And if you're sitting down with me, then relax, grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's talk neuroscience. So, as a reminder, the show, what Neuroscience for Numpties is all about, is making neuroscience accessible to the average person. So you don't need to have all those pesky years of graduate school or what have you, all the training and so forth. I would like to do whatever I can to bridge the gap between what neuroscientists understand about the brain and the body and then what the average, general public will say believes about the brain and the body. So today's episode, well, let me back up a little and say I realized in the first episode that, well, it was a lot of talking about what Neuroscience for Numpties is going to be as opposed to actually demonstrating what Neuroscience for Numpties is. So that's what I would like to really focus on in the show moving forward, is demonstrate Neuroscience for Numpties for you guys. And I think most of the episodes are going to be me breaking down literature, like actual scientific publications in the field of neuroscience, and just breaking down their bottom lines. What did the study do? What did they find? Why was it important? Things like that. And so I do have an article in mind, and I'm really excited to share it with you guys because it's actually the first publication that I'm going to share with you is it literally birthed the field of brainwave-based lie detection. I mean, nobody knew that brainwave-based lie detection was possible before this publication came out. So that is where I want to get to, but what I realized was that I can't just sit down and jump right into a publication, because it would be helpful first to talk about things like the scientific method. And I also realized in the previous episode I didn't even define neuroscience. And so I'd like to back up just for a second before I jump into all these publications. I just want to back up and define science, define neuroscience, talk a little bit about the scientific method, and then maybe in the next episode we can jump into the actual publications. Okay, so that's enough housekeeping out of the way. Why don't we jump into the episode? So first of all, what is science? So science, well, think about it like this. We want to think about, what does science do? Science is the most objective means of understanding the world around us that we have. Actually, not just the world around us, but ourselves as well. So what makes science objective? How does that work? So, well, that is the scientific method. And there's 7 steps to the scientific method, and so I'm going to define those for you and illustrate a little bit of an example. So let's start with step number 1, is that you have some kind of question about the world. So in this example, I'm going to use texting and driving, right? So you might think that, okay, maybe if I text and drive, my driving performance isn't going to be quite as good as it normally would be, because I'm dividing my attention not only to driving, but also to texting on the phone. So it would make sense. It's kind of common sense that if you're multitasking, you can't dedicate all of your attention to one thing. So you might expect your driving performance to suffer while you text. Now, the first step is to just come up with that question. What is that question that you want to answer? So our question is, will driving performance suffer if you're texting on a cell phone? Now, step number 2 would be the research. So what you want to do, of course, you're probably not the first person to wonder about that question. And so you're going to look up the literature, and I mean the scientific literature, on what have other scientists who have also had that question, what have they done to sort of answer that question, and what did they find? So that's called a lit review. So you're going to do a review of the literature and just summarize what have other scientists found. That's step number 2. Then step number 3 is, based on all of that literature, you're going to generate a hypothesis. And I can tell you right now that if you were to go on Google Scholar or what have you and look up publications about driving performance and cell phone usage, you would find that driving performance suffers as a result. So that's what previous experiments have found. And so your hypothesis, you want your hypothesis to be in line with what other people have found. And I suppose I should also define what a hypothesis is. A hypothesis to a scientist is what in, normal everyday language you would call a theory. When you say, oh, I have a theory about the way the world works, that's what scientists call a hypothesis. A scientific theory is a hypothesis that has been supported time and time and time again, and it has lots of evidence behind it. So a scientific theory is a much more formal thing. Scientists don't just casually throw theory around. Instead, they say hypothesis when they have some sort of casual observation about the world. And even a hypothesis is sometimes not so casual because you would have had an entire lit review behind it, right? So, because that was step number 2. So in our step number 3, you're going to make a hypothesis, and it would be very smart of you to use the literature that you just reviewed to kind of create that hypothesis. So we would find that, a lot of people have found that cell phone usage impairs your driving performance, and so I'm going to predict the same thing. But now I have to design an experiment, which is step number 4. I'm going to design an experiment to test this hypothesis. So let's say that you let me say this. The benefit of an experiment is that you actually get to control every little detail, every aspect of the experiment. So it's a little bit artificial. Experiments are criticized for that. Experiments can typically be done in a lab, and it's not exactly being done in the real world. So they can be criticized for being artificial because you say, okay, well, maybe you found that driving performance was inhibited on some sort of driving course that you designed in an experiment. But how do we know that that course represents how people drive in real life, or their performance on that course represents how people drive in real life? So you might actually, there would actually be a couple different ways to get at this question. And this is where I can illustrate the difference between something called observation versus experimentation. So observation addresses that criticism of the sort of fake, artificial criticism that people worry about with experiments. Observation, you're just going to take a look at how things occur in the natural world. And but then, of course, the issue of that, the con, is that you don't get to control every little thing, and so it can be difficult to know when you find an effect of some sort that, let's say, driving performance was in fact inhibited by or impaired by cell phone usage, and maybe you sent a survey out to a bunch of drivers in, let's say, the state of Illinois. And you ask them about their cell phone usage, and then you look at their driving history, and you notice that people who, use their cell phone a lot while they're driving have higher accident rates. That would be something that is more observational. You're looking at real data in the real world. It's not, data that you acquired in a lab somewhere. It is real world data. But the problem is that you can't exactly establish something called causation. You don't know that, the people who talk on their cell phone while they drive, you don't know that it's because of their cell phone or their cell phone usage that they therefore had worse driving histories. So it's hard to establish that causation if you didn't get to control every little thing. So that's then the benefit of the experiment, is that if we had set up like a driving course, and then you have a driving instructor from the DMV comes in and he's going to grade everybody's driving performance on that course, then you have a more objective means of, I didn't finish. Let's say you set up a driving course and you have a driving instructor from the DMV who comes in and grades everybody's performance on the course. And then you need 2 groups. You need one group of people who are going to just drive normally and without a cell phone. And then you're going to have another group of people who you've asked them to carry on a text conversation with a friend while they're also driving through the course. So then you would grade their performance, or have the instructor grade their performance, and then you're going to compare each group. Well, which group did better on the course? And you might find that the cell phone group did worse because they were texting and they, accidentally hit like a traffic cone, or they didn't come to a complete stop at the stop sign, or what have you. So in that situation, we know for a fact that it was the cell phone usage that made that group perform worse on the driving exam. So that way, so those are the differences between observation versus experimentation. And I think most of the time when I'm, looking at the literature and breaking that down for you guys, we're mostly going to be covering experiments, not so much the observation side of things. So, but I did want to show you a little bit of the difference. What are the pros and cons of each approach? And you'll notice that a lot of times in these experiments that people do get criticized for using, yes, this works in the lab, but how do you know that this is the way the real world works? You'll see that as a very common criticism of experiments. Okay. But in this case, so for our example, let's say that we go with the driving course. We design the driving course and get the driving instructor and so on and so forth, because we want to know for a fact that cell phone usage impairs your driving ability. Okay, so that was step number 4, was design the experiment. Now, step number 5, you've conducted the experiment, you got all of the data, all in this case, the driving performance of each individual in both of your 2 groups, the cell phone group and the no cell phone group. And then you're going to make observations about your data. So, what did you find? And that kind of also leads into step 6, is you can think of step 5 as like your analysis of the data. You make your observations, you analyze with math, statistics, and so forth. And I'm not going to go too much into detail about statistics right now. Maybe I'll have a future video about some general statistics, because obviously we are going to run into a lot of statistics in these publications. But it's not necessary for you guys to know the nitty-gritty of the statistical tests. It's kind of my job to get rid of the nitty-gritty stuff and make this as easy as possible. So I probably won't spend too much time on statistics, but it is something that I really like. I do enjoy statistics, so I might have a video or 2 about statistics from time to time. So step number 5, you conduct all of your analyses, and then step number 6 is you're going to look at your results and you're going to write up your conclusions. So in your expert opinion, what happened? Did the cell phones actually impair the driving ability based on the results of these tests that you conducted? And the only point I want to make there in step number 6 is that data, they don't really speak for themselves. By the way, data is plural. Datum is singular, if you didn't know. So you say data are and datum is. Now you know. So step 6, when you're talking about your results, the data aren't going to, they're not self-evident. There is a certain amount of subjectivity in the tests that you can perform, the analyses you can conduct, I should say, the statistics and so forth that you're going to use. And then the actual interpretation of those results, it can be a little bit subjective. So you do need someone to interpret the results of those statistics, and how well they interpret the statistics are based on how good they are at statistics. And so you can get people who make mistakes, or if they don't understand the statistics very well, then that's going to impair their ability to interpret the results and to talk about the results. That's why I, as a scientist, think that statistics are extremely important, because you have to, you can only talk about your results, and I'll put it another way, you can only answer your question as well as you know how to use the statistics. So that's why I think statistics are extremely important. And the final step number 7, is to communicate what you found. So now that you've written down all your results and conclusions, then you're going to communicate and present your results in a publication or a poster presentation, something like that. And so you'll find that most every publication kind of is a mini scientific method. They all follow this similar structure. A publication starts with a question. They'll pose a question to you. Hey, here's the question we're trying to answer. And then they'll do a little lit review of, hey, here's what other people have found. And so then they'll make their hypothesis and say, okay, based on all this literature, we're going to predict X, Y, or Z. And then here's our experiment, and here's how we designed it. This is why we designed everything this way. Here's the analyses that we conducted, and then here's our results and conclusions, and then those results and conclusions get published. So every publication is like a mini scientific method. So that's why I thought it was important for us to cover the scientific method, so it gives you the general outline of what a publication looks like. Okay. Now we have about 5 minutes left, and I did want to define neuroscience for you guys before we wrap things up today. So, which is a little bit difficult to do in 5 minutes, but to give you like the elevator pitch, if science is a systematic study of the world around us, then neuroscience would be a systematic study of the human body, but specifically of the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system, which is everything that's attached to your spinal cord that goes out into your limbs and so forth. And so what's important to understand about the brain and your nervous system, well, your nervous system is what enables behavior, right? So if, when I was in college, I actually, I was just a budding psychologist, and I thought, well, what does the nervous system have to do? Why do I have to learn all this physiology in order to understand psychology? Isn't psychology just how people think, just think and behave? But the nervous system is what enables you to, well, have thoughts and behave, So, you can't move your arm or navigate the world if your brain can't communicate with your limbs, right? So, and I suppose I should say, how does your brain do that? Well, I think it's useful to use the analogy of a telephone wire, that when your brain wants to like talk to your hand and have it do something, like reach for a mug of tea or something, then your brain has to send a signal, and we can talk a little bit about what that signal is, but your brain has to send a signal to your hand to tell it to do something. And it communicates that signal through wires called nerves. So nerves are kind of like a telephone wire that connects to your brain, and it goes down into your spinal cord, and then it exits through, the spinal cord and into your arm and your hand. And also lots of other places in the body, of course. But those nerves, kind of like telephone wires, they carry current. They carry an electrical charge. And so your brain is actually communicating, with the limbs in your body and also the organs in your body. Very similar to kind of like a telephone wire, would send a signal to someone's telephone. I know that we landlines aren't super common anymore. Everything is wireless, but our bodies didn't advance to that stage. They never learned to be wireless. So we have wires everywhere. That's what your spinal cord actually is. The inside of your spinal cord, inside the the bone or the casing, you have a whole bundle of wires essentially. And so that's really fascinating, that the brain is actually electrical. It has electrical components to it. Now, I don't mean to underemphasize the chemical components, because of course there's a lot of different chemicals running through your body and your brain. But because we're going to be talking so much about brain waves, I thought it's important to emphasize the electrical components of the body and the brain. And especially because most people might not even realize that your body and your brain are electrical. So, and that kind of leads me to transition to what a brainwave is. So if you ever wondered, what the heck is a brainwave? Well, a brainwave is the electrical activity of the brain, as opposed to the chemical activity of the brain. So you can measure the electrical activity on the brain or of the brain by using these things called electrodes that they pick up on electricity. And so now this electrical activity is very, very small. It's not incredibly strong activity, but there's a lot of it. There's a lot of different, they call them frequencies of activity. I don't want to get too technical about all of this, but you know what, for now, especially since we're coming to the end of the video, why don't we say, for now, all I want you to understand about brainwaves is that they are electrical signatures in the brain, and they're involved with how the brain communicates with itself. The brain has more than 200 structures. If you didn't know, it's an incredibly complex organ. And it communicates with itself electrically, and it communicates with the rest of your body through these electrical signals. And so, but we're going to be focusing on the how the brain communicates with itself using these electrical signals, and those are called brainwaves. And you can actually infer by looking at the electrical signals in the brain what someone's thinking about or how the brain is processing information. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. And I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye for now.